The strangest thing about truly remarkable people is that they never try to look remarkable at all. Ethan Caldwell had spent 20 years building a reputation for seeing what everyone else missed. In boardrooms from Manhattan to San Francisco, investors trusted his instincts more than spreadsheets. Competitors feared his ability to notice tiny details that turned into billion-dollar opportunities. At 41, the founder of Caldwell Ventures had become one of the most respected businessmen in America, not because he was the smartest man in every room, but because he paid attention when others stopped looking. That was why it bothered him when he couldn't explain what happened on a rainy Thursday evening in downtown Chicago. The rain tapped softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Hawthorne Grill, an upscale restaurant tucked between steel towers and luxury hotels. Ethan sat alone near the back of the dining room, reviewing acquisition documents on his tablet while a cup of black coffee cooled beside him. Around him, conversations floated through the warm air. Executives celebrated deals. Tourists admired the city lights. Waiters moved carefully between tables carrying expensive meals beneath golden chandeliers. Everything looked exactly as it should. Then the front door opened. Ethan barely glanced up. New employees came and went all the time in places like this. But something made his eyes return to the entrance. A young waitress stepped inside, adjusting the sleeve of her uniform before quietly speaking with the restaurant manager. Her name tag read Claire Bennett. Blonde hair pulled neatly back. Simple black uniform. No jewelry except for a worn silver watch on her wrist. Nothing unusual. Nothing memorable. And yet Ethan found himself watching. Not because she was trying to attract attention. Quite the opposite. Claire seemed determined not to attract any attention at all. While other servers smiled brightly at customers and hurried across the dining room hoping for larger tips, she moved with calm precision. No wasted motion. No nervous energy. No need to impress anyone. She simply worked. Ethan frowned and returned to his tablet. 5 minutes. Later, he looked up again. Claire was taking an order from an elderly couple. She listened without interrupting. Nodded once. Smiled gently. Then walked away. Nothing special. Except Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen that kind of composure somewhere before. It wasn't the confidence of a waitress. It was the confidence of someone accustomed to making important decisions. He told himself he was imagining things. The day had been long. 3 meetings. A delayed flight. Too much coffee. Yet 30 minutes later, he realized he had spent more time observing the new waitress than reviewing a deal worth nearly $400 million. That annoyed him. Ethan Caldwell did not become distracted by strangers. He certainly did not become distracted by employees in a restaurant. He looked down at the acquisition report and forced himself to focus. Then something happened. A customer at a nearby table accidentally knocked over a glass of iced tea. The drink spilled across the table and onto several documents spread in front of him. Before anyone else reacted, Claire appeared. Not rushing. Not panicking. Calm. She quickly lifted the papers, separated the dry pages from the wet ones, placed clean napkins beneath the stack, and reassured the embarrassed customer with a quiet smile. The entire situation was resolved in less than 30 seconds. Most people would have forgotten the moment immediately. Ethan couldn't. Because for a brief second, as Claire organized those papers, he noticed something unusual. Her eyes moved across the pages. Not casually. Not accidentally. She scanned them. Almost as if she understood exactly what she was reading. Then she walked away without a word. Ethan stared after her. Outside, the rain continued falling against the windows. Inside, the restaurant buzzed with ordinary life. Yet a strange thought settled into his mind and refused to leave. Claire Bennett was hiding something. And for the first time in years, Ethan Caldwell found himself unable to look away. The thought followed Ethan Caldwell all the way back to his penthouse that night. It lingered through the elevator ride, through the city lights stretching beyond his windows, and even through the stack of reports waiting on his desk. Claire Bennett should have disappeared from his mind the moment he left the restaurant. Instead, her image remained strangely clear. The next morning, Ethan arrived at his office before sunrise. The headquarters of Caldwell Ventures occupied the top 20 floors of a glass tower overlooking Lake Michigan. Normally, his attention belonged entirely to numbers, forecasts, and negotiations. Yet while reviewing quarterly projections, he caught himself staring at the reflection of rain clouds gathering outside. His mind drifted back to the quiet waitress. By noon, He found an excuse to schedule a lunch meeting near Hawthorne Grill. By 6 o'clock that evening, he was back in the same corner table. He told himself it was coincidence. He did not believe it for a second. The restaurant looked much the same as the night before. Warm lighting, soft music, the gentle clink of glasses. Ethan ordered coffee and opened his tablet. Then he noticed Claire crossing the dining room. Once again, she moved differently from everyone around her. Not faster, not slower, simply more deliberate, as though every step had purpose. She approached his table carrying a coffee pot. "Good evening, sir. Would you like a refill?" Her voice was calm and professional. Ethan looked up. "Please." Claire poured the coffee without spilling a drop. Most servers glanced at the cup while pouring. Claire never looked down. Her attention remained on the room around her, quietly aware of everything happening nearby. It was a small detail. Ethan noticed small details for a living. "You are new here," he said. "About 3 weeks. Do you like it?" Claire smiled politely. "It pays the bills." Then she moved on before he could continue the conversation. Ethan watched her walk away. Most people recognized him immediately. They asked questions. They sought opportunities. They mentioned investments or business headlines. Claire did none of those things. It was almost unsettling. An hour later, the answer to one mystery created another. A man in an expensive suit entered the restaurant carrying a leather briefcase. Several employees greeted him. Respectfully, Ethan recognized him at once. Professor Nathan Whitmore, one of the most respected economists in the country, a best-selling author, a consultant to major financial institutions. The professor spotted Claire and smiled warmly. Not the polite smile customers gave employees. A genuine smile. The kind reserved for people you know well. Ethan watched as Nathan approached her station. Claire's face brightened slightly. They exchanged a few quiet words. Then something unexpected happened. Nathan handed her a folder. Claire opened it and reviewed several pages. Her expression changed. She pointed to a section near the middle. The professor nodded thoughtfully. Then she pointed again and said something that caused him to laugh softly. Ethan stared. Nathan Whitmore did not seek business advice from restaurant servers. Yet from the professor's body language, it looked exactly like that. Several minutes later, Nathan left. Claire returned the folder and resumed working as though nothing unusual had occurred. Ethan could no longer focus on his meal. The puzzle pieces refused to fit together. A waitress who read documents like an executive. A waitress who carried herself like a leader. A waitress who somehow knew one of the most respected economists in America. As Claire passed his table once more, Ethan glanced at the worn silver watch on her wrist. For the first time, he noticed an engraving along the side of the metal band. The letters were small, nearly impossible to read from a distance. But one word caught his eye. Founder. Claire continued walking without noticing his reaction. Ethan leaned back slowly. Outside, thunder rolled across the Chicago skyline. Inside, a single question echoed through his mind. Who exactly was Claire Bennett? Some mysteries arrive with answers. Others become deeper every time you look closer. Ethan Caldwell had built an empire solving complicated problems, yet Claire Bennett was rapidly becoming the one puzzle he could not explain. The following afternoon, he found himself thinking about the engraving on her watch during a meeting that should have demanded his full attention. Founder. The word refused to leave his mind. By evening, he was back at Hawthorne Grill for the 3rd time in 4 days. Even he could no longer pretend it was coincidence. The restaurant was busy when he arrived. Rain had finally cleared from the city, and people filled nearly every table. Claire was already working. She moved through the crowded dining room with the same calm confidence he had noticed from the beginning. No rush, no stress, no visible frustration, just steady focus. Ethan ordered coffee and quietly observed. Then something unexpected happened. A group of executives entered the restaurant carrying laptops and presentation folders. They appeared frustrated. One man in his 50s kept checking his watch, while another repeatedly shook his head. Their conversation grew louder as they settled into a booth near the center of the room. "The presentation starts tomorrow morning," one of them said. "If we cannot fix the forecasting model tonight, the entire proposal falls apart." Another sighed heavily. "We have already reviewed it 6 times. Claire approached their table and took their orders. Ethan returned to his tablet, expecting nothing more. 20 minutes later, however, he noticed the same group still arguing. Papers covered the table. Charts, financial projections, revenue estimates. The executives looked increasingly discouraged. As Claire delivered their meals, one of the men accidentally pushed a report toward the edge of the table. Several pages slid onto the floor. Claire immediately bent down and gathered them. Most servers would have simply returned the papers. Claire paused, just for a second. Her eyes moved across one page, then another. A faint expression crossed her face. Not surprise. Recognition. "Excuse me," she said politely. The executives looked up. "I am sorry to interrupt, but I think line 27 may be causing your projection problem." Silence. The men stared at her. One laughed awkwardly. "You understand financial models?" Claire seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. "Only a little." The oldest executive glanced at the page. "What do you mean line 27? Claire pointed carefully. "Your growth assumption is being applied twice. Once here and once in the automated adjustment below. It creates an inflated forecast." The table fell silent again. One executive grabbed a calculator. Another opened his laptop. 30 seconds later, his eyes widened. "She is right." Nobody spoke. Claire offered a small smile. "I hope that helps." Then she walked away carrying an empty tray as though nothing unusual had happened. Ethan sat perfectly still. Across the room, the executives continued checking their numbers. Every calculation led to the same conclusion. The waitress had solved a problem that their entire team had missed. 10 minutes later, one of the men approached Claire near the service station. Ethan could not hear the conversation, but he saw the executive offer a business card. Claire politely declined. The man insisted. Claire shook her head and returned to work. The executive walked away looking more impressed than offended. Ethan leaned back slowly. Most people would have celebrated. Most people would have used the opportunity to talk about their accomplishments. Claire acted as though none of it mattered. Yet what happened next bothered him even more. Near the end of the evening, Claire sat alone during her break with a notebook open in front of her. Ethan watched from across the room. The pages were filled with diagrams, flowcharts, organizational structures, market strategies. Not simple notes, not casual sketches. They looked remarkably similar to executive planning documents he had reviewed countless times inside boardrooms. Then Claire closed the notebook, slipped it into her bag, and quietly returned to work. Ethan stared into his coffee. The question was no longer whether Claire Bennett was hiding something. The question was how someone with skills like hers had ended up carrying plates in a restaurant. And for the first time, he began to suspect the truth might be far bigger than he imagined. The more Ethan Caldwell learned, the less anything made sense. During the following week, he found himself rearranging meetings without admitting why. Lunch appointments drifted closer to Hawthorne Grill. Evening calls ended earlier than usual. What began as curiosity had quietly become a habit. Almost every day, he found himself sitting at the same corner table with a cup of black coffee, watching a waitress who seemed determined to reveal nothing about herself. Claire Bennett never encouraged conversation. She never lingered beside tables hoping to impress customers. Yet somehow, people gravitated toward her. One Tuesday evening, Ethan arrived just in time to witness another strange moment. A young couple sat near the window looking frustrated. Their laptop was open between them. Financial spreadsheets covered the screen. Claire approached with their meals, then paused when she noticed their expressions. The woman laughed nervously. "We are trying to decide whether opening a second location is a terrible idea." Claire smiled politely. "That sounds important." The man sighed. "We have been arguing about it for 3 weeks." Claire glanced briefly at the spreadsheet before setting down their plates. Sometimes the wrong question creates the wrong answer. Both customers looked up. "What do you mean?" Claire pointed toward the screen. "You are measuring whether you can afford to grow. Maybe you should measure whether you can afford not to." The couple exchanged confused looks. Claire simply wished them a pleasant dinner and walked away. 40 minutes later, Ethan noticed the couple smiling for the first time all evening. They looked energized, hopeful. Somehow a single sentence from Claire had shifted their entire perspective. It was not the first time Ethan had seen something like that. Customers left conversations with her looking calmer, more confident, as if she had quietly solved problems they had struggled with for weeks. The strangest part was that she never acted like an expert. She never offered long explanations. Usually it was just one observation, one question, one idea. Then she returned to work. On Thursday evening, another clue appeared. Ethan arrived earlier than usual and parked across the street while finishing a phone call. Through the restaurant window, he spotted Claire sitting alone before her shift began. A notebook rested beside her coffee cup. She was writing something carefully, not a journal entry, not personal notes. Her pages contained diagrams, timelines, and strategic plans. Ethan recognized the structure immediately. It looked remarkably similar to the planning frameworks used by senior executives inside Fortune 500 companies. Before he could study further, Claire closed the notebook and slipped it into her bag. A few minutes later, she entered the restaurant and became an ordinary waitress once again. That evening, Ethan finally decided to ask a question. When Claire stopped by to refill his coffee, he glanced toward her silver watch. "You wear that every day?" Claire looked down at it briefly. "Yes. It seems important." For the first time, a shadow crossed her expression. Not fear. Not sadness. Something deeper. "It reminds me of someone." Ethan waited for more. None came. Claire simply refilled the cup and moved on. Yet her answer stayed with him long after she disappeared into the dining room. Outside, the Chicago skyline glowed beneath a clear night sky. Inside, Ethan realized he had crossed an invisible line. He was no longer observing a mystery from a distance. He was becoming emotionally invested in finding the answer. And that realization unsettled him far more than any secret Claire Bennett might be hiding. By the beginning of the second week, Ethan Caldwell finally did something he had spent days resisting. He stopped pretending his interest in Claire Bennett was casual. The realization came late one evening as he sat alone in his office overlooking the Chicago skyline. Below him, thousands of lights stretched across the city like stars scattered across dark water. On the glass wall beside his desk hung photographs of acquisitions, partnerships, and milestones that had defined his career. Every major decision had started with a simple question. What am I missing? The same question now followed him everywhere. The next afternoon, he arrived at Hawthorne Grill earlier than usual. Claire was helping prepare the dining room before customers arrived. Sunlight filtered through the front windows, painting long golden lines across polished tables. For a few minutes, the restaurant felt unusually quiet. Ethan watched as Claire arranged menus, checked reservations, and greeted coworkers. With the same calm professionalism she showed every day. Then something unexpected happened. The restaurant manager approached her carrying a folder. He appeared stressed. Claire listened quietly as he explained something. After a moment, she took the folder and reviewed several pages. Her eyes moved quickly across the information. Then she pointed to a section near the bottom and said something Ethan could not hear. The manager blinked twice, looked again, then smiled with visible relief. Whatever problem had existed seemed solved within seconds. Claire handed back the folder and continued setting tables as though nothing unusual had happened. Ethan could not ignore it any longer. When Claire eventually approached his table, he decided to test a theory. "Can I ask you something?" Claire nodded politely. "You can ask." Ethan slid a business card across the table. Not his public card, his private one. The card he reserved for senior executives and trusted partners. "I am hiring a strategic analyst," he said. "Six-figure salary. Full benefits. Flexible schedule." Claire looked at the card, then at Ethan. Her expression remained unchanged. "That is generous. You have a talent for solving problems." "Everyone solves problems." Ethan smiled faintly. "Not like you." For the first time, silence lingered between them. Around them, customers continued arriving. Silverware clinked softly. Music drifted through the room. Claire studied the card for a moment before sliding it back toward him. "I appreciate the offer." Ethan waited. "But," Claire smiled gently, "but I am not interested." Ethan was genuinely surprised. Most people would not reject an opportunity like that without hesitation. Claire had done it in less than 10 seconds. "May I ask why?" She glanced toward the dining room. A young employee was struggling to carry a tray. Claire immediately stepped over, helped steady it, and offered a few encouraging words. The employee smiled with gratitude. Only then did Claire return her attention to Ethan. Because not every opportunity is the right opportunity. Her answer sounded simple, yet something about it felt deeper. Ethan leaned back slowly. He had spent his entire career believing success meant saying yes to bigger opportunities. Claire seemed to operate by an entirely different philosophy. As she walked away, Ethan noticed something sticking out of her bag near the service station. A folded piece of paper, just visible enough to catch his attention. Across the top, written in bold letters, were the words Project Horizon. The name struck Ethan immediately. Years ago, Project Horizon had been the internal code name for one of the most influential business transformations in modern corporate history. Very few people knew that. Even fewer had ever been connected to it. Ethan stared at the paper until Claire quietly tucked it back inside her bag. For the rest of the evening, he could think of nothing else. Because for the first time, he was no longer chasing a possibility. He was chasing a connection. The next morning, Ethan Caldwell arrived at his office carrying more questions than answers. Project Horizon. The name had followed him through the night like an unfinished conversation. Years earlier, it had become one of the most discussed corporate transformations in the country. Business schools still studied it. Executives still referenced it during conferences. Entire companies had adopted strategies inspired by its success. Yet very few people knew who had actually designed the framework behind it. The public face of the project had always been a famous chief executive officer. The architects behind the scenes remained largely invisible. Ethan stood beside the windows of his office overlooking Lake Michigan and stared at the city below. Something about Claire Bennett's reaction the previous evening had felt significant. Not surprised. Not nervous. Almost familiar. By late afternoon, curiosity finally overcame restraint. Ethan called his longtime chief of staff, Daniel Brooks. Daniel had worked beside him for nearly 15 years and knew how his mind operated. When Ethan became interested in something, he rarely stopped until he understood it completely. "I need information on someone," Ethan said. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Business competitor?" "No." "Potential acquisition?" "No." Daniel looked genuinely confused. "Then who?" Ethan hesitated for a moment. "A waitress." Silence filled the office. Daniel blinked twice. "A waitress?" Ethan almost laughed at how ridiculous it sounded. "Her name is Claire Bennett." Daniel waited for an explanation. None came. "Just background research," Ethan finally said. "Nothing invasive. Public records only." 2 days later, Daniel walked into Ethan's office carrying a thin folder. Far thinner than Ethan expected. "This is everything?" Ethan asked. Daniel nodded slowly. "That is the strange part." Ethan opened the file. Claire Bennett. Age 28. Current employment at Hawthorne Grill. Apartment rental on the north side of Chicago. Basic tax records. Standard identification documents. Nothing unusual. Nothing remarkable. Yet there was one detail neither man could ignore. For years were missing. Entirely missing. No employment history. No professional records. No public appearances. No social media activity. Almost nothing. Ethan looked up. "That is impossible." Daniel nodded. "I thought the same thing." In the modern world, people did not simply disappear for 4 years. Not without leaving traces behind. Ethan continued reading. The records before those missing years were equally confusing. Claire had graduated near the top of her class from Northwestern University. Economics. Organizational leadership. Outstanding academic recognition. Then suddenly the trail vanished. Ethan closed the folder. The gap bothered him more than anything else. Missing information was rarely random. Missing information usually meant there was a story. 3 evenings later, Ethan returned to Hawthorne Grill. The restaurant felt unusually quiet. Snowflakes drifted gently beyond the windows, softening the glow of the city outside. Claire was working her usual section. Calm, focused, unchanged. Ethan studied her for several minutes before noticing something new. During a short break, Claire sat alone near the rear entrance with her notebook open. A young employee approached her carrying a stack of papers. The employee appeared anxious. Claire listened carefully while reviewing the pages. Then she smiled and began explaining something. Within minutes, the employee's shoulders relaxed. Relief replaced worry. Gratitude replaced uncertainty. Ethan watched the interaction closely. He had seen executive coaches charge thousands of dollars for that kind of guidance. Claire gave it freely. When the conversation ended, the employee walked away smiling. Claire closed the notebook and glanced toward the snowy street outside. For a brief moment, her expression changed. The confidence remained. The calm remained. Yet there was also something else. A quiet sadness. The kind carried by people who had loved deeply and lost something important. Then the moment passed. She stood, returned to work, and became invisible once again. Ethan stared into his coffee. The missing years. The hidden expertise. The strange connection to Project Horizon. None of it fit together. Yet one thing had become absolutely clear. Whatever secret Claire Bennett was protecting, it was not about ambition, money, or status. It was about something far more personal. Some truths arrive quietly, not because they are small, but because they are too important to announce themselves. The breakthrough came on a cold Friday afternoon. Ethan Caldwell was reviewing documents between meetings when Daniel Brooks entered his office carrying another folder. Unlike the first file, this one looked thick. Very thick. Daniel placed it carefully on the desk. "I found something," he said. Ethan immediately sat forward. "What?" Daniel opened the folder. The missing years were hidden behind a corporate confidentiality agreement. It took time to connect the records. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. Daniel slid a photograph across the desk. Ethan stared at it, then stared again. The woman in the picture looked younger, but there was no mistake. It was Claire, standing on a stage in front of hundreds of people, wearing a navy business suit instead of a restaurant uniform, smiling beside executives, investors, and technology leaders. Ethan looked up slowly. "What company is this?" Daniel exhaled. "Ether Dynamics." Ethan froze. He knew the name immediately. For years earlier, Ether Dynamics had become one of the fastest-growing artificial intelligence companies in the country. Business magazines had called it revolutionary. Investors had fought for ownership stakes. At its peak, the company had been valued at nearly $800 million. Ethan turned back to the photograph. "Claire worked there?" Daniel nodded. "Not worked there." He slid another document forward. "She co-founded it." Silence filled the office. Ethan stared at the page. Co-founder, Claire Bennett. The words felt impossible. Yet suddenly dozens of unanswered questions began fitting together. Her understanding of strategy, her leadership instincts, her ability to solve complex problems in seconds, her connection to respected economists and executives. The notebook, the watch, everything. Daniel continued. Most public interviews focused on the chief executive officer. Claire stayed behind the scenes. According to several reports, she designed the company's operational framework and long-term growth strategy. Ethan leaned back slowly. The waitress carrying coffee cups every evening had once helped build one of the most successful technology companies in America. Yet one question remained. If she helped build an $800 million company, why is she working at a restaurant? Daniel hesitated. That part took longer to uncover. He handed over a final document. Ethan read silently, then read it again. 3 years earlier, Claire had sold nearly all of her ownership stake. Not because of financial trouble, not because of scandal, not because the company failed. She had left voluntarily, completely. Public appearances stopped. Interviews stopped. Professional activity disappeared. Ethan looked at the final paragraph. There was only one clue. Multiple sources referenced a serious family medical situation involving her younger brother. Nothing more. No details. No interviews. No public statements. Just silence. For several moments, Ethan could not speak. Outside the office windows, snow drifted across the city skyline. Inside, everything he thought he understood had changed. That evening, he arrived at Hawthorne Grill earlier than usual. Claire was arranging silverware near the front of the restaurant. The same simple uniform. The same calm expression. The same worn silver watch. Customers walked past without recognizing her. Nobody knew they were passing someone who had once helped shape an entire industry. Ethan watched quietly from across the room. Claire greeted an elderly customer, helped a nervous new employee, refilled coffee cups, listened patiently to people who would never know her story. And for the first time since this mystery began, Ethan stopped looking at Claire Bennett as a puzzle to solve. He began looking at her as someone extraordinary who had chosen to disappear from a world that would have celebrated her name. The truth finally revealed itself on a quiet Sunday evening. Snow covered the sidewalks outside Hawthorne Grill, muting the sounds of the city and wrapping Chicago in a blanket of white silence. Inside the restaurant, business was slow. Soft music drifted through the dining room, while customers lingered over coffee and conversation. Ethan Caldwell sat alone at his usual table. For the first time in weeks, he was not there to investigate. He was there because he genuinely enjoyed being in the presence of someone whose priorities he could not understand. Claire moved through the restaurant as she always did. Calm, focused, invisible to most people, extraordinary to anyone paying attention. Near closing time, the final customers left. Chairs were being stacked. Lights were beginning to dim. Ethan stood to leave when he noticed Claire sitting alone near the window. The worn silver watch rested on the table beside a steaming cup of tea. For several moments, she simply stared at the falling snow. There was a loneliness in her expression he had never seen before. Not weakness, not regret. Something quieter, something deeper. Ethan hesitated before approaching. Long day. Claire smiled softly. Not the longest. Ethan sat across from her. Neither spoke for a moment. The city lights reflected against the glass behind them. Snowflakes drifted through the darkness like tiny floating stars. Finally, Ethan looked at the watch. You once said it reminded you of someone. Claire followed his gaze. Her fingers rested gently on the metal band. For the first time since they met, she did not avoid the subject. My brother. Ethan remained silent. Claire looked back toward the window. His name was Ryan. Her voice stayed steady, but something changed in her eyes. He was 4 years younger than me. Smarter than I was. Funnier too. A faint smile appeared. He could make an entire room laugh without even trying. Ethan listened carefully. Claire continued. When ether dynamics started growing, everything happened fast. Investors, interviews, conferences, recognition. People told me I was living the dream. She paused. At the same time, Ryan was getting sick. The restaurant seemed quieter than ever. Claire looked down at the watch. For a while I thought I could balance both worlds. Build the company during the day. Take care of him at night. She shook her head gently. Eventually I realized something had to give. Ethan already knew the answer, yet hearing it felt different. More real. More human. You left the company. Claire nodded. I sold my shares. Stepped away from everything. Most people thought I was making a terrible decision. She smiled sadly. Maybe from a business perspective they were right. Ethan glanced around the nearly empty restaurant. Do you regret it? Claire answered immediately. Not for a second. The certainty in her voice left no room for doubt. She looked at the watch again. Ryan gave me this before I left. Her fingers traced the engraved metal. He said success means very little if you do not spend it on the people you love. Ethan felt something tighten inside his chest. Claire continued quietly. We had 3 more years together. A peaceful smile appeared. 3 years of conversations. Road trips. Movies. Bad jokes. Ordinary days that became priceless. She looked out at the snow again. Eventually those years ended. But I would choose them again every single time. Ethan sat silently. The mystery that had consumed him for weeks finally stood completely revealed. There had been no scandal. No secret betrayal. No dramatic collapse. Claire Bennett had simply made a choice few people were brave enough to make. She walked away from extraordinary success in order to be present for someone she loved. And, somehow, sitting across from her in a quiet restaurant, Ethan realized that might have been the most extraordinary achievement of all. The conversation stayed with Ethan Caldwell long after he left the restaurant that night. As he drove through the quiet streets of Chicago, the city looked different. The skyscrapers still reached toward the clouds. The billboards still celebrated success. The financial district still glowed with ambition. Yet for the first time in years, Ethan found himself questioning the definition of achievement he had spent a lifetime chasing. Over the following weeks, he continued visiting Hawthorne Grill. Not to solve a mystery anymore. Not to uncover another secret. Simply because he enjoyed the conversations he shared with Claire Bennett. They talked about business. They talked about books. They talked about cities they had visited and lessons they had learned. Yet the subject that returned most often was perspective. Claire had a way of looking at life that made complicated things seem simple. One evening, as snow melted from the sidewalks and early signs of spring began appearing across the city, Ethan arrived carrying a proposal. Not a business proposal. Something far more personal. The restaurant was quiet. Claire was finishing her shift when he approached her table near the window. He placed a small folder in front of her. Claire looked at it curiously. What is this? Ethan smiled. An opportunity. Claire laughed softly. We have already had this conversation. Not this kind. She opened the folder. Inside was a plan for a nonprofit foundation. A leadership and scholarship program designed to help talented young people from difficult circumstances develop business skills, financial literacy, and professional confidence. Claire studied the pages carefully. Ethan watched her expression. I have spent years building companies, he said. But lately I have been thinking about building something that lasts in a different way. Claire continued reading. You want me involved? Ethan nodded. I want you to lead it. Claire looked up immediately. Ethan. He raised a hand gently. Not because of your resume. Not because of ether dynamics. Not because of what you accomplished. He paused. Because of who you are. Silence settled between them. Around them, waiters cleaned tables and prepared for closing. Outside, a warm breeze moved through the streets. Claire slowly closed the folder. For a moment, Ethan thought she might refuse. Instead, she smiled. It was the same quiet smile he had seen dozens of times. Yet this one felt different. Lighter. Hopeful. "I will think about it," she said. Ethan laughed. "That is the closest thing to yes I have received from you." Several months later, the foundation officially launched. Young entrepreneurs arrived from across the country. Students, veterans, single parents, first-generation college graduates, people with potential but limited opportunity. Claire became the heart of the organization. She taught strategy, leadership, and decision-making. But more importantly, she taught perspective. She taught people that success was not measured only by money, titles, or recognition. Ethan often watched from the back of the room as she spoke. The same woman who once carried coffee cups now inspired future business leaders. Yet somehow she remained exactly the same. Humble, thoughtful, grounded. One afternoon, after a scholarship ceremony, Ethan noticed the familiar silver watch on her wrist. Sunlight reflected softly from the engraved metal. Claire followed his gaze and smiled. "Ryan would have liked this." Ethan nodded. "I think he would have been proud." Claire looked around at the students talking, laughing, and planning their futures. Then she glanced toward the sky. "The funny thing is," she said quietly, "I used to think I walked away from success." Ethan smiled. "And now?" Claire's eyes reflected both gratitude and peace. "Now I think I finally understand what it was." Ethan stood silently beside her. Because after everything he had learned, he understood it too. Sometimes the most extraordinary people are not the ones who climb the highest. Sometimes they are the ones willing to step down, walk away, and choose what matters most. And in a world obsessed with being noticed, that may be the rarest kind of success of all.